Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine War Frontline update, first part of these, first one of these for 5 days, I think. So it's a 5-day update for the 28th of August 2025. Expect quite a few pins, therefore, being quite a few days. Also, it's worth mentioning that I said the momentum seems to have been shifting. I thought there was a bit of a momentum shift for the last update. The question is, has that momentum been sustained if it was indeed a momentum shift? And what are the Russians doing about it? And had the Russians culminated? Were they running out of troops and resources and their own sort of momentum? Was I correct, essentially, in saying there was a momentum shift? And I think I was correct, although I think the Russians are reacting against some of the Ukrainian areas where they had taken the initiative. So part of understanding a momentum shift is understanding who has the initiative. What you want to do at some point, the Ukrainians cannot forever sit on defense, because if you sit on defense, you are always reacting to what the Russians are doing. The Russians are dictating where your troops are going to be, and they are basically pulling the puppet strings, and you are the puppet, they are the puppeteers. So at some point, Ukraine need to do things to make the Russians react, and therefore the Russians go on the defensive, and they are having to put troops where you define, and they have to play whack-a-mole. And I think we'd started to see that, but the question was, well, what are the Russians going to do about that? And that is most evident down in the Pokrovsk region, where the Ukrainians had this surprise attack and they took Myrne, and the Russians appear to be reacting against that, because that could have developed into something very, very positive for the Ukrainians. But we'll get there a little bit later. We'll start up in Sumy. Take this with a pinch of salt, because this is coming from Syriac maps. Remember, the dark cherry red pins suggest that according to Syriac maps, one of the mappers, a pro-Russian mapper, the Russian defensive line has gone from being in that arrangement to coming down to here, that they have pushed back in this town of Vrachyrna. So a place where the Ukrainians have been attacking and making ground on the last mapping update. Now the Russians pushing back there, and supposedly in Unmanned as well. But that is, as I say, a pro-Russian mapper that generally listens to the Russian MOD and adapts a map irrespective of what any other evidence might say. But it could be that the Russians are pushing back in this one area, in one of the areas where the Ukrainians have definitely had momentum, which is up in Sumy, pushing the Russians back. In fact, this is where Syrskyi has said the Russians have been defeated. No change along the Kyiv border here in any of these three places. Indeed, there's another place just to the west as well. No change there. Now, one of the major concerns for Ukraine has been Kupiansk, and the Russians have been attacking into Kupiansk. There have been a number of different claims as to what's been going on here. Some claiming that the Ukrainians have been pushing back and countering there. Just before I go there, actually, I want to just talk further about momentum and what's been going on. Dnipropetrovsk, the mapper, one of the mappers on my synthesis map, says, in essence, Ukraine has spent the last few weeks and the following few weeks as well, reorganizing their defensive scheme, choosing where to defend and where not to defend. And these areas may not match with where Russia wants Ukraine to defend or where Russia wants to attack. In some areas, Ukraine concedes ground, like the Zaporizke forest, for example. In other areas, Ukraine is taking ground and will take more, which I think is an interesting way of looking at it. And to be honest, one of Andrew's major criticisms of Ukraine over the course of the war, and also some others too, has been that the Ukrainians often defend places for far too long that they needn't defend, and choose not to defend certain areas that have far more utility and importance, and it's just making the right decisions about where they put their resources. So this appears to be Ukraine saying, reorganizing themselves to put their resources where they are most needed. And we'll come on to look at some of the areas mentioned there, or one of the areas. But here in Kupiansk, it could be that the Russians really are still putting a lot of pressure on the Ukrainians. There were some claims, as I said, that the Ukrainians were pushing back there. Here, after drone strikes on Russian positions in Kupiansk, Ukrainian fighters managed to repel them and regain control. This was from 3 days ago from N-Strike there. And you can see north of the city or town of Kupiansk along that main road. So you've got that triangle of road up there. This is where we're talking about here, that the Ukrainians have retaken control of this area, but that's not reflected. Oops, going in and out there. That's the map doesn't do exactly what my fingers tell it to do, which causes issues like that. And here we have exactly the same area on the map. From end strike in the Kharkiv region, Kupiansk, Ukrainian forces destroyed Russian reconnaissance and sabotage groups that had infiltrated the city's northern outskirts and advanced several kilometers forward. So yeah, that says that the Ukrainians have there pushed back the Russian, and I'm just trying to remember when that was from. That was from the 26th, so 26th, 27th. That is to say that the Russians have been pushed back here, but again, not reflected in these two mappers' interpretations of the data. It looks like both mappers think that the Russians have come down and taken control of this area to the northwest of Kupiansk and really coming to encircle it there. So that is certainly a concern. In fact, Dnipropetrovsk changed from having no control and then the control right back here in the last 5 days to the Russians controlling all of this area. And if he says that's the case, he is one to be believed a lot more, I think, than Surek Maps there. So they're both actually agreeing on that. You can see there's a big difference of opinion over here to the east of Kupiansk. We'll have to watch that area. This is, I think, one of the main concerns of the Ukrainians, a real worry there. Then when we come down, we see that the Ukrainians are pushing back in the direction of, so this is south of the area where the Russians have reached the Oskil River up here, the Pischany sector. Actually further down in the Liman sector here, you've got a village called Novoheorhiivka that the Ukrainians have apparently retaken. This is a sense of the momentum shift with two villages, Kyiv that I reported last update. Surek Maps now agreeing that that has been retaken, Kyiv, and that the Ukrainians have pushed back in Novoheorhiivka. Here we have the 3rd Army Corps and the GUR Special Forces in Novoheorhiivka in the Liman direction, so doing the old flag trick there, putting up a flag in the village. So success for the Ukrainians in that sector. But as we come further to the south, we're going to come on to the Serebyansky forest. So this looks really worrying, right? Because the Russians have essentially just taken the vast majority of the Serebyansky forest off the Ukrainians here. And what Andrew says in explaining this is that this is an area where it wasn't worth the Ukrainians piling in huge amounts of resources. Especially, you could argue that the Russians had moved along to Serebyanka, the town, south of the Seversky Donetsk River here, through this high ground, and have had this success in this area. And that led the Ukrainians to think maybe it's not worth holding on to all of this up here. So maybe doing a tactical withdrawal and I don't know, going back to more favourable areas. Fighting in the forest has been difficult, but the Ukrainians had held out there for an awful long time. So I wonder exactly what the rationale is there for the Ukrainians, but certainly this area and further to the north towards the Liman direction, the Russians having some much greater success. And indeed, now we have Dnipropetrovsk admitting that the Russians have control over Terney, something that Surek Maps had claimed a long time ago, and now there's either it had eventually happened, or there has been subsequent data to confirm that's good enough evidence for Dnipropetrovsk. Interesting that there's no change in Chasiv Yar. Some people claiming that the Russians are making gains in Chasiv Yar. Some Russians are claiming that. I think that was in the Institute for the Study of War update from from last night. Russian forces continued offensive operations in the Chasiv Yar direction, but did not make confirmed advances. So they're still fighting there, but no confirmed advances. Confirmed means that ISW will confirm it. Now we come down to Toretsk, and Playfro, one of the Ukrainian sources that does a lot of mapping and has sources in this area, saying that actually the Ukraine is still holding on tenuously, albeit, to an element of control of Toretsk, or they are present in and around this area. But really, the Russians are in the ascendancy here. This is an area where the Ukrainians were starting to push back some time back, maybe, I don't know, 2 months was it? But now the Russians really have started to, or not started, have put the pressure on the Ukrainians here, and really they're putting pressure on Kostyantynivka, a real challenge for the Ukrainians. Now, here we have no reports saying just now Russian troops have amassed heavy armour in the Kostyantynivka axis, and they have renewed their mechanised offensives there. In response, though, Ukraine's Phoenix Regiment of Unmanned systems intercepted an assault, taking out a Russian tank and two well-executed drone strikes. But that, to me, is just the interesting part about the Russians amassing troops here. And then having, according to Syriac maps, some success further to the west, north of Poltavka, but no confirmation there from Dnipropetrovsk. Then we get on to what's going on around here. So just to remind you, the Russians pushed all the way up here. This is the Dobrapilya sector where they were pushing towards Petrivka, Novotroitska, all the way up here. You've got Dobrapilya over here, this larger town, quite a significant town there. Actually, I'd minimise the size of that, but it's bigger than I had previously thought. So Dobrapilya, fairly sizable town. That's what the Russians were kind of moving towards. In fact, they did end up having some people who were cut off and running away to certain villages around here, getting as far as Dobrapilya, some were saying. But you had the Ukrainians being forced to deal with the Russians that had got as far as some of these, as Zoloty Kolodyaz. It looks like, all the mappers have agreed that the Russians have been pushed back largely here. And Syriac Maps still has a very charitable interpretation of the data around that sector. The Institute for the Study of War has actually fairly charitable for the Russians up to around about here, but how much they actually control is up for interpretation. So there are different claims as to how successful the Ukrainians have been in pushing back here. And then we had the story of Myrne. So Myrne is this small settlement here that the Ukrainians pushed through the Russian lines to reach, and were looking to, so people like Scruffy Tails and other mappers are saying, I mean, this was potentially a really good move for the Ukrainians, because what they could have done, and might still be able to do, is getting into here, having control of something like that, is then, getting your troops to shore up your fortifications there, and at the same time push down here and do something like that, and then you cut off all of the Russians that are left around here. And that would have been really, really problematic for the Russians. There are some real opportunities here. They can move up some tree lines. They could get to Shevchenko Pershi. And then, real problem, because actually there's this town of Shakova here that the Russians really would like. If they get Shakova, then things become a lot easier for them in this whole sector. And the Ukrainians really don't want them to take Shakova. So taking back the initiative here, the Ukrainians could have pushed down from the Shakova area with enough troops and support and resources, and then push up through Myrne. What Scruffy Tails as a mapper, he's a great mapper, has a really good grasp of what's going on, particularly in Pokrovsk here at the moment. He was saying that the Russians really need to sort this out. If they don't, then that could happen, and it looks like the Russians have. So it looks like the Russians have attacked the Ukrainians from this direction, from the southeasterly direction, to try and cut the Ukrainians off as they are pushing forward there. So if we do some drawing on the page here, you've got the Ukrainians kind of getting in there, looking to move up to there. The Ukrainians potentially with the ability to push down from the north as well, and then the Russians wanting to cut them off at the base of that by attacking in that direction across into there. So it is very dynamic at the moment. It was what was expected. Scruffy Tails said for his updates, this is a really good move from the Ukrainians, but the Russians will want to stop this, rather like the Ukrainians wanting to stop this attack from the Russians, and they did so. They immediately threw in some troops to defend around there. Likewise here. So we'll have to see how that develops, but it is pretty dynamic there at the moment. The Institute for the Study Awards is talking about all sorts of claims around this area. It's very sort of detailed. The Pokrovsk across to up to that Toretsk sector over here. This whole area is all happening really. If we go to some of the sources, Tatragami said, so far Ukraine's stabilization measures around Pokrovsk look broadly promising. While many speculate that Kyiv might strike some elsewhere, Ukrainian forces have instead pushed back Russian troops in an area where Moscow's leadership had placed its biggest bet. And this is what I talked about in the last update, which is, this is where the Russians really had the wind behind their sails, were attacking. They had the deep reconnaissance groups all the way up here. They were going to send in their exploitation forces, which they kind of were in the process of doing. Ukrainians, some claiming they had trapped the Russians there. It was all part of their plan. I'm not so sure. But anyway, Ukrainians counterattacked fairly briskly and did a really good job of attrited huge amounts of Russian troops, particularly, and some material as well. And the question was, do the Ukrainians keep going? Rather than then say, right, we've closed that down. Let's now pull out of there and do whatever we were previously going to do with those troops, like the Azov and the National Guard units there. And it looks like they have been now concerning themselves with some kind of counter-attack options in this region. And so Tataragami says, they've instead pushed the Russian troops back in an area where Moscow's leadership had placed its biggest bet. With only days left before the autumn season, the chances of Russia taking Pokrovsk by summer's end are virtually nil. Amid the so-called peace talks, the lack of progress risks undermining Russia's resolve to fight for years. So they are, as they like to boast, that does not mean Russia will stop advancing, but if the political goal remains the takeover of Donbass, achieving it by the end of this year appears impossible. For Ukraine, the main objective now is to avoid a catastrophic breakthrough or an operational level collapse at Russian hands, something akin to the rout Russia itself suffered in Kharkiv in 2022. For Russia, by contrast, the challenge is to prove its tactics viable and to show that just a little more pressure will indeed cause Ukrainian defences in the Donbass to crumble. For now, however, Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar remain a difficult objective despite maximum efforts. I think that's a really fair analysis there. That I think there has been a change in momentum from the Ukrainians, but then the Russians are going to want to stamp out that change in momentum because it will be deeply embarrassing for them. So although it may completely exhaust them, I bet they're just going to be throwing absolutely everything they can at the Ukrainians in this sector and in any other sector where the Ukrainians are having some success. It depends. I don't think Sumy, to be fair, if I was Russia, I would have pulled my troops out from Sumy as well. I don't know that this is, unless you can, surreptitiously get North Koreans in there and do that kind of work for you. Those Russian troops, I think, are going to be much more sensibly positioned around here, because if you really are intent on getting Donbass, forget about Sumy for now. It's great to have Sumy. Yeah, it's great to get near, I'm talking as a Russian here, great to get near the city of Sumy and try and hit it with artillery. But realistically, those troops would be better placed to try and take Pokrovsk, try and take Chasiv Yar. You're a year behind taking Chasiv Yar, and you are behind your intentions on Pokrovsk as well. So, this is where I'd have those Russian troops. So I think there has been a change in momentum up in Sumy, but that could see renewed forces being brought from the Sumy direction to the Pokrovsk direction. So you could then get renewed pushes in this area, even though I previously said there was a change in momentum. The Russians have reacted to that. Going further along here, you can see that the Russians, according to Andrew Perpetua, now controlling Kotlina. Again, that seems to have gone back and forth like a yo-yo. This is just north of the railway line that skirts past Pokrovsk there, or up to Pokrovsk. You've got Udachne as well under control of the Russians, according to Surat maps, but not quite so much according to Andrew Perpetua, but some gains there too. Slightly worrying for the Ukrainians. And then the Ukrainians pushing being pushed back in Horikove here. So this is a area Troitska Horikove where the Ukrainians have been attacking and having some success. According to Surat maps, at least, the Russians have pushed them back there. We're going to just go back to Pokrovsk, though. There are claims about this area Leontovich here that is south of Trianda, south of Pokrovsk, where you had these infiltrations of Russian troops. And the Ukrainians were clearing them out. Now, there's a claim here that indeed the Ukrainians have retaken control of this kind of whole area there. And yeah, that is back under their control. If you go to the Institute for the Study of War, it does agree, or at least a Russian mill blogger has claimed that Ukrainian forces have counterattacked there. But you actually have varying claims around this area. So, some Russians claiming that they have pushed forward in that area. Russian forces conducted offensive operations there in this area too. So it is claimed, both sides claim some kind of success around here. No mappers have changed there, but you might see that come under Ukrainian control in the next mapping update, because it's generally thought the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians out of those sectors. Then we're going to come down a little bit further, just making sure I'm not ahead of... Oh my goodness, I am. So this is Myrne, northwestern outskirts of Myrne. That's... let's have a little look. Yeah, sorry, I had it in the wrong order, and this is worth talking about, actually. So let's go back to Pokrovsk. Sorry to flip around so much. You got Pokrovsk here, you got Myrne here. We talked about how the Ukrainians have pushed up into Myrne. The Russians are counterattacking here. And then you've got this area where Surat Map says that the Russians have actually made some gains. So kind of that's weird, although this is a 5-day update, so the Russians may have made those gains and then the Ukrainians may have pushed in, or not really sure. Anyway, you've got this area, Novoekonomichne, and then Mikhailivka. You've got Mikhailivka and Mirolubivka. You've got Mikhailivka here, but spelt slightly differently. Mikhailivka and Mikhailivka. Yeah. Anyway, very Mikhail and Mikol. This has caused confusion as to where the Russians have been attacking, where the Ukrainians were attacking. As some people are saying they're attacking down here, as others up here, and actually confusion over the name. These are not the same names, but my goodness, they're almost the same name, and they're right next to each other. But then we have this road, the T0504 goes all the way up to Chazivya and Bakhmut. This in this area where there's a slight change of direction there. This is the area on the map here, where, as you can see, there's a slight change of direction there, where the Ukrainians have counterattacked successfully, and this is only from today, right? So Grayskull saying the Ukrainians have taken control of this whole area, that basically this whole area here. Now, this is in the grey zone, much of it, but some of it, according to Surat maps, is under Russian control here. This is the idea that the Ukrainians now control this whole area. And of course, if we look at Grayskull's map, if we come south from there, so Surat maps has this whole area here under Russian control, and that is simply not the case. Like, all of this area here, according to Grayskull at least, is not under Russian control. And indeed, if the Ukrainians had pushed through to Myrne, which most people seem to agree, including Surat maps, then it seems weird and very dangerous that they would do that if they didn't control this whole area here. Like, you are so vulnerable. This is just like a tree. This is a tree line's width of control. And if you are up here with anything near considerable forces, you're going to be cut off way too easily. So I assume Surat maps is wrong here, and the Ukrainians are going to be trying to widen their control here, widen that bridgehead. But at the same time, we are under the impression that the Russians are pushing back from the southeasterly direction. So it's all going to be very dynamic. But yeah, sorry, I had that in the wrong place. So that I wanted to talk about that area. Right, then we're going to properly come down here. There are claims that the Russians have taken some land in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast and taken 2 villages. Monitors claim Russia captured 2 Dnipropetrovsk Oblast villages for the first time. Kyiv hasn't confirmed it. And this is coming from the 26th, so a couple of days ago. This is Novoheorhiivka and Zaporizke. And Zaporizke is, I think, somewhere where people are admitting. Tim White says DeepState has confirmed the news I reported yesterday that Russia's occupied Zaporizke, first notable village in Dnipropetrovsk. The tiny hamlet of Novoheorhiivka is also now captured, according to DeepState as well, in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. So let's try and put that on a map, on the map. So those two villages are going to be past where the Ukrainians are pushing the Russians back, around Tolstoy. Remember, we talked about that last time. Zeleny High up here. So the Ukrainians, this is an area where they've got a bit of wind behind their sails, maybe trying to cut off this sector here where the Russians are. You've got a river that comes along here, and that's been somewhat used as a natural barrier. The Ukrainians can get behind that and cut the Russians off. That could be useful. There's quite a few villages around there, but we'll see how that turns out. And then we come further down to the south here, and we get onto these two villages in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. So if you look closely at the map here, you have these white dotted lines. That is the Dnipropetrovsk border, and here it comes down, meeting here. You got Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk, and probably, I don't know, we got Zaporizhia. No, it wouldn't be. Yeah, Zaporizhia. So Zaporizhia is along south here. You got Zaporizhia here. Don't know if you can see those white dotted lines. Zaporizhia here, Donetsk up here, and Dnipropetrovsk up here. Now, Zaporizhia and Donetsk have been added to the constitution of the Russian Federation, artificially so, or unfairly so, and whatnot, illegally so. They just took the land and then added it to their constitution, but they didn't add Dnipropetrovsk because they were nowhere near it at the time. Now they've got into Dnipro and taken control of two villages, so Zaporizhia there and Novoheorhiivka, which is up here. If they do control those two, then that you might see them go, oh, by the way, we've added Dnipropetrovsk to the constitution, and that, even though it might just be this tiny area all the way down here where they've got like a little circle there, actually they'll say, right, now we own all of Zaporizhia. Now this is all in our constitution or whatever. You get the point. So sorry, Dnipropetrovsk, not Zaporizhia. So now all of Dnipropetrovsk, including the city of Dnipro and all this other area up here, this is all now under Russian ownership, because we've taken two small villages here. So that was something that the Ukrainians wanted to avoid, but it was looking very, very difficult for them to avoid it, because it's not just here that's close to the Dnipro border. There's also other areas where the Russians could easily just nip across and take a few villages here and there. So I think that was always going to happen, but the question is whether the Ukrainians will think that this is worth expending a lot of energy and resources and manpower in defending, or whether they have other options elsewhere that they would prefer. But as you can see, according to Andrew Perpetual, quite a bit of land here under Ukrainian control, making it somewhat similar to what Surrey maps have previously stated in the area, at least to some degree. Okay, then we're going to come along to the Zaporizhia front line. I don't think I have anything else to add from Donetsk and Dnipro. Come along to the Zaporizhia front line, and we're actually going to go to an area near, I think, Hlyapole, and we've got Marfapil here. It looks like, I think, the Ukrainians have pushed back a little bit in Malynivka. Is that near Marfapil, Malynivka? And the answer is yes, sort of. So you've got Marfapil here, you've got Hlyapole there, and around here, Malynivka, the Ukrainians have pushed back again. Could be a sign of a momentum shift, as I was talking about last time. Certainly, we haven't been seeing Ukrainians counter in many places like this for a long time. But anyway, does that tell us anything more significant, or is it just a really kind of somewhat random counterattack they put on? I guess they want to be protecting some of this infrastructure down here. It's particularly Hlyapole. I mean, it gets quite a lot of unfortunate attention from the Russians here. Gallipoli and Orikhiv are both targeted quite consistently. Orikhiv back over in this direction. There we are. So that has happened. Ukraine has pushed back there. Certain maps has the Ukrainians having pushed the Russians out of Stepova, or back from Stepova to some degree, a small village, as we get closer to Kamyanska. Now, Kamyanska, as you can see, both mappers have the Russians advancing here. This seems to be a place that appears to be rather like a yo-yo. The Ukrainians will push back, then the Russians push back again. I think this was one of the places where the Russians were maybe gearing up for an offensive because they wanted to get close to Zaporizhia city in the same way that we've seen at Kharkiv and Sumy. But I think the Ukrainians have foiled their attempts by hitting logistics, ammunition, troop accumulations, material before it's got to the front. But I'm fairly sure that there have been so many rumours that the Russians are amassing troops for a push in Zaporizhia. I'm fairly sure that's one of the places. And it is a bit like a yo-yo at the moment here. The Ukrainians definitely do not want to lose this big time, because then it is just a bit of a march up the side of the reservoir to Zaporizhia, and you've got problems. So the Ukrainians will definitely want to hang on to this. Now, Julian Rupka from the Bild says Russian invasion forces have advanced another 2.5 kilometers to here and captured the train station at Plavny, which is pretty significant because that's actually here, right? And that is further north from where we've got at the moment on the map, just north of this kind of inlet there, as you can see. Now, if that's true, the Russians have made some serious advances right up the coastline here. We then have, in the opposite direction, David D, although he's a bit of a cheerleader for Ukraine, sometimes a bit too positively, to the point where, not quite accurate, or, it needs to be a little bit more nuanced. He is referring to Russian accounts here. So Russian accounts saying active combat activity in the Kamyanska area. So if you look at the accounts here, this is, control to the east of where we were. There's that sort of inlet and the train station there. So the Russians could well be up to there. But this Russian saying attacked by Russian armed forces with infantry groups west of Stepnohirsk, counterattacked by Ukrainian armed forces, several Russian soldiers taken prisoner. And David D talks about it's a good day when pro-Russian accounts are yelling about large amounts of Russians giving up. And I don't know that's exactly what that says, but the claim here is that there are some Russians that are, morale is not good. And we had actually heard from strikes in this area, in some of these staging areas around here, that actually morale is really poor. So, could be that you are getting some desertions around here, talking possibly about Russians being captured there as well. But I think this is an area where the Russians, at least previously, were wanting to attack and might still want to. Really, that's enough from me for the Frontline update there. It is a real mixed bag of nuts. The Ukrainians have some options. That Myrne attack, if they were able to really opportunistically capitalize on this strike, really could cause the Russians a lot of trouble. But the Russians will know about that, and they will be wanting to throw everything at stopping any Ukrainian attack into that area. Was that kind of planned, or was this part of the pushing back in this area? And therefore, are the Ukrainians fully planned, and have they fully planned and organized to do something like this? And is it worth suddenly committing all sorts of troops and material to something that might be a bit of an overstretch for them? So this is an area I think to watch out for over the next couple of weeks, really over the next couple of days as well. Anyway, that's enough from me. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.